They stopped visiting. Not a call. Not a card. Not even on birthdays. Margaret Dorsey waited. Waited for her sons, her daughters-in-law, her precious grandchildren. But the only footsteps she heard were from Melissa, the quiet, attentive caregiver who made her tea just right. So when the time came to write her will, Margaret made a decision. A decision that would send shockwaves through the family. This isn't just a story about inheritance. It's a story about abandonment, revenge, and the bittersweet power of choices. By the time her children found out, it was far too late. They'd left her in silence. So she left them in shock. Stay till the end, because the final twist is something even Margaret didn't see coming. Like, share, and subscribe, especially if you believe every senior deserves more than just memories. Margaret Dorsey lived in a large, well-kept Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood of Evanston, Illinois. Once bustling with life, laughter, and Sunday roasts, it now echoed with creaks, the ticking of clocks, and the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower. The photos on the mantel, snapshots of happier times, were beginning to fade. Her two sons, Greg and Alan, had moved away years ago. Greg to California, chasing startup dreams. Alan to Florida, escaping winter and responsibility. Their calls became quarterly. Their visits became yearly. Then non-existent. She would set the table on Thanksgiving, just in case. She would bake the apple pie Greg used to love. She would even make the strange green bean casserole Alan's wife insisted on. But the chairs stayed empty. It was Melissa, the caregiver hired after Margaret's mild stroke, who filled the silence. First just a helper, then something closer. Like family, but more dependable. Melissa was a single mother in her early 40s. She worked long hours, never complained, and always smiled. She'd wheel Margaret to the park, read her passages from old novels, and even made a scrapbook of Margaret's old photos. Where Margaret's children brought absence, Melissa brought presence. Margaret began journaling. Each night after Melissa tucked her in, she would write about her memories, her regrets, and her slow, painful realization. She had given everything to her sons, her youth, her money, her years. But they had given her nothing in return. She wrote about the birthdays missed, Christmases with cold phone calls instead of warm hugs, and the one time she was hospitalized for pneumonia and Greg didn't even respond to the voicemail. It wasn't anger that crept into her writing. It was grief. And it simmered for a long, long time. Margaret's lawyer, Mr. Lyle Bancroft, was a quiet man with sharp glasses and a sharper sense of justice. When she first brought up changing her will, he raised an eyebrow. "Are you certain, Mrs. Dorsey?" "I am," she said calmly. "My sons already took everything that mattered. Now it's time to give what's left to someone who actually shows up." So they did the paperwork. Melissa would inherit the house, car, the bonds, cash accounts, everything. But Margaret didn't stop there. She wrote letters, one for Greg, one for Alan. Not angry, not bitter, just honest. Letters that began, "I waited for you," and letters that ended with, "You were always my child, but you forgot to be mine." The letters would be delivered after her passing. Margaret kept the new will locked in a safe. And as the final leaves of autumn fell onto the porch, she felt a strange peace settle in. Maybe it was the crisp air, or maybe it was the quiet power of taking control at last. She had been forgotten, but now she would not be ignored. It began with ink and ended in fire. Margaret's journals started innocently. They were therapy, really. A quiet place to pour the ache of being forgotten. But they soon became something more, a map of memories, motherhood, and mourning. Each entry was dated, and each one told a little story. The time Greg scraped his knee and she stayed up all night making sure he didn't get a fever. The time Alan wet the bed at summer camp and she drove 3 hours with fresh sheets, pretending to be a laundry volunteer. Every time they cried, she had cried harder. And every time they forgot her birthday, she remembered every detail of theirs. Melissa found the journals one day while organizing the bookshelf. "You should publish these," she said gently. "They're like a life story. The real one." Margaret smiled. "Maybe. One day." But Melissa's words lingered. That night, Margaret asked her to read aloud from the beginning. Melissa's voice wavered on the third page. "Greg forgot again this year. He said he was busy with a product launch. He didn't ask about the pneumonia. I told him I was fine. I lied." They sat in silence. "Do you want to stop?" Melissa asked. "No," Margaret said. "I want to keep going." So night after night they read. Became a ritual. Communion. As if, in hearing it aloud, Margaret was reclaiming the worth of her story. One night, after a particularly painful chapter about Alan missing her 70th birthday party to go on a cruise, Melissa closed the journal and said, "You need to do something with this." Margaret nodded. I'm leaving it behind." Melissa looked puzzled. "In the safe." With the will, the journals became part of the legacy. Not money, not property, truth. And truth, Margaret believed, was the one thing her children couldn't contest. But one entry, dated 10 years ago, was different. It began with, "I've never told anyone this," and what followed would change everything. The journal entry began innocently enough. "I've never told anyone this, not even Richard." Richard was her late husband, a quiet man who had loved her dearly but didn't always ask too many questions. That's how Margaret had wanted it. Melissa read the line twice. "What's this one?" she asked, pointing. Margaret reached slowly for the journal, her fingers tracing the yellowed page. "I wrote it 10 years ago. But it goes back much further. 1969. Melissa blinked. "That was the year Greg was born." Margaret nodded, her lips thin. "Yes. And the year. I made a choice." What unfolded in the next few paragraphs wasn't rage or scandal. It was something quieter, more tragic. Margaret had once been engaged before Richard, a man named Jacob Geller. They were young, fiery, in love, and he had been deployed to Vietnam. When he didn't return for months, everyone assumed the worst. Margaret was devastated and vulnerable. Richard, her childhood neighbor, proposed in a whirlwind of comfort and protection. 3 months after their wedding, Jacob returned, alive. And Margaret never told him. The entry ended with, "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had waited just one more week." Melissa sat frozen. "Does Greg know?" "No," Margaret whispered. "No one does." Melissa gently asked, "Do you think he's Jacob's?" Margaret looked toward the window. "Sometimes I do, especially when I see the way he smiles." It's not Richard's smile. This revelation wasn't just about DNA. It was about legacy and silence and how much a mother carries even after decades. The weight of that secret, now written down, read aloud, shifted something in Melissa, and it would soon shake the entire Dorsey family to its core. 'Cause Margaret had left a sealed envelope inside the safe, labeled simply, "Greg, only open if you truly want the truth." The weather was unusually cold for spring. Evanston's skies were gray, and a bitter wind swept through the old cemetery where Margaret Dorsey was being laid to rest. Greg and Alan stood stiffly at the edge of the small crowd, both looking more like men waiting for a delayed flight than grieving sons. Greg kept checking his phone. Alan muttered something to his wife, who wore oversized sunglasses and a frown. Melissa stood near the casket, holding a small bouquet of lilies. She wasn't crying, but her jaw was tight, her eyes focused. She had been with Margaret at the very end, held her hand, read her one last passage from her favorite novel, whispered, "You were never alone." Neither son gave her more than a passing glance. After the service, when the final spade of dirt fell, a man in a dark coat approached Greg and Alan. It was Lyle Bancroft, Margaret's lawyer. "We need to schedule a will reading," he said simply. Greg looked annoyed. "Now?" "No," Lyle said. "But soon. There are details." Alan sighed. "Just email us whatever forms. We'll sign. I assume everything's split 50-50? Lyle blinked. "Actually, no. You may want to attend in person." The brothers exchanged looks. Suspicion flickered. 3 days later, they gathered in Lyle's office. Melissa was there too. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Why is she here?" "Because," Lyle said, opening a sealed envelope, "your mother wanted her to be." And with that, the storm began. Margaret had left behind not just assets, but a voice. Her will included recorded videos, dated letters, and very specific instructions. And the first sentence of her video message would be burned into their memories forever. "If you're watching this, it means I've finally done what you refused to do," I showed up. The room was silent as Margaret's recorded message played on a flat screen in the conference room. Her voice, steady but tired, filled the air. "I spent the last 20 years waiting. 4 calls, 4 visits, for signs that I still mattered to the sons I raised. But instead, I found company in a stranger who became more like family than either of you ever tried to be." Greg and Alan shifted uncomfortably. Melissa sat still, a mix of sorrow and resolve in her expression. Margaret's video continued. "That's why I've left everything to Melissa. Not out of spite. Out of truth. She earned it. You did not." Greg's face turned red. "You can't be serious. This has to be illegal." Lyle cleared his throat. "It's all above board. Your mother was of sound mind. The documents are notarized. Witnessed. Ironclad." Alan's voice cracked. "But we're her children." "She remembered that," Lyle said gently. "Which is why she left you each a letter." He handed them envelopes. Greg's hand trembled as he opened his. Inside was one line in Margaret's elegant script. "You taught me the cost of love, so I finally paid myself back." Alan said, "I gave you my best years. You gave me your absence. We're finally even." Greg slammed his fist on the table. "We're contesting this." Lyle sighed. "You can try, but I wouldn't recommend it." He turned to Melissa. "There's one more thing." Margaret requested that her memoir, her journals, be compiled and published. Melissa blinked. "What?" She titled it, "They Forgot Me First." Melissa stood frozen in Lyle's office, still holding the sealed envelope. The memoir. Margaret had written everything, every truth, every ache, every secret, and wanted it published. "I'm no writer," Melissa whispered. "You don't need to be," Lyle replied. "She already wrote it. You just have to carry it forward." Melissa took the envelope home that night and opened the first page. Began with, "To those who feel forgotten, I see you. I was you." As she read the manuscript aloud to herself, something inside her changed. This wasn't just a memoir. It was a reckoning. She reached out to a small local publisher who, moved by the story, agreed to help. They titled it exactly as Margaret had asked. "They Forgot Me First." Within weeks, early copies hit the shelves of independent bookstores. And by the end of the month, a retired teacher's story, of being ignored, of being dismissed, of finding peace on her own terms, was going viral. Margaret's words struck a nerve, especially among seniors, and especially among adult children who quietly wondered if they'd done enough. TV segments followed. Podcasts. Book clubs. Melissa was invited to read excerpts at libraries. People cried. Greg and Alan watched from afar as their mother became beloved posthumously by strangers. "She made us look like monsters," Greg spat one night. Alan didn't respond. He was starting to wonder if maybe they had been sat on Greg's kitchen counter for weeks. Cream-colored. Handwritten. Labeled, "Greg, only open if you truly want the truth." He stared at it every day but couldn't bring himself to open it. Until one sleepless night, after a television interview of Melissa reading a journal entry aired nationally, Greg cracked. He opened it. Inside was a short letter. And a photograph. The letter read, "You may not believe me, and that's okay. But you deserve to know Jacob Geller was your father. He never knew. I was scared and I was already married. But your heart was always too big to belong to Richard. I see Jacob in your smile." Greg trembled. Jacob Geller, the name was familiar. He remembered a man once visiting their school, a veteran, who shook his hand and stared at him too long. The photo was of Margaret and Jacob in 1969. Young. In love. And behind it, a DNA test kit. And used. If you truly want to know, the truth is yours to confirm. But either way, I loved you. Even when you forgot me. Greg sat at the table until sunrise. He never spoke of the letter to Alan. But that week, he disappeared from social media, called in sick to work, and quietly mailed the test. Melissa hadn't expected the story to spread like wildfire. Within 6 weeks of the book's release, she was fielding calls from talk shows, morning anchors, and even a Netflix producer. They Forgot Me First was now more than a book, it was a movement. Caregivers wrote in. Strange children. Seniors who wept, saying Margaret told their story too. One morning, Melissa woke to a knock at the door. It was a reporter from the New York Times. "I just want to know," he asked softly, "what Margaret was like in her quiet moments." Melissa invited him in and shared a cup of tea. "She used to hum while I combed her hair," she said. "And she would always save half her biscuit for me. Every morning." That quote became the headline. "She saved a biscuit for me, remembering Margaret Dorsey." The article went viral. Overnight, sales of the book tripled. Greg and Alan were flooded with interview requests they didn't want. "She's turned us into a national cautionary tale," Alan grumbled. But Greg said nothing. He had just gotten an email. His DNA results were ready. Greg sat alone at his desk. The email subject line stared back at him. "Your DNA results are ready." He clicked. And there it was. Confirmation. Jacob Geller, 99.9% paternal match. His world tilted. Richard Dorsey, the man who raised him, was not his biological father. But that wasn't the real shock. The real shock was how much he suddenly wanted to know who Jacob had been. What music he liked. Whether he was still alive. Greg Googled his name. Found an obituary from 3 years ago. Survived by a sister, a niece. A war medal recipient. Teacher. A painter. Greg wept. Not because he had lost something, but because he had never been told it was his to begin with. He printed out Margaret's letter. Framed it. Hung it above his bed. And then, quietly, he booked a flight to Vermont, where Jacob was buried. Melissa returned to Margaret's home one final time. It was now hers, but she hadn't moved in yet. The room still felt like Margaret's. She entered the attic for the first time. Dust motes danced in sunlight filtering through the cracked window. In a cedar chest, she found a stack of letters tied in blue ribbon. They were addressed, but never mailed. Dozens, maybe hundreds. To Alan. To Greg. To myself. One by one, Melissa sat and read. In them, Margaret had poured everything. Her guilt, her love, her hopes, and the grief of being forgotten. She had written about birthdays alone. Hiding her tears on Mother's Day. About how she forgave them but could never forget. There were also notes to Melissa. You reminded me I still mattered. You saw me when no one else did. Melissa wept, sitting cross-legged on the floor. These letters, she decided, would not be burned. They would be preserved. The attic had been full of silence. Now it echoed with Margaret's voice. Greg and Alan hadn't spoken since the will reading, but Greg, returning from Vermont, asked for a meeting. At a quiet cafe, he shared the truth. Alan was stunned. "You're telling me Dad wasn't your dad?" Greg nodded. "And she never told me. Never told him. It was all in that envelope." Alan was quiet for a long time, then said, "Does that mean we're not really brothers?" Greg looked at him. "No. It means Mom had more pain than we ever realized." They sat in silence. Then Alan asked the question that had haunted him for months. "Do you think she hated us?" Greg shook his head. "No. I think she loved us. Right up to the moment we made her feel invisible. It wasn't an apology, but it was the beginning of something that looked like healing." Melissa stood before a crowd at the grand opening of the Margaret Dorsey Legacy Foundation, an organization that would provide in-home companionship, advocacy, and small grants for isolated seniors. First donors were anonymous, but Melissa knew who they were. Greg and Alan had both quietly contributed. Margaret didn't want pity, Melissa told the crowd. She wanted people to show up. We're here to do just that. The foundation's slogan? Be the visit they waited for. Media covered it. Margaret's book continued to sell. People across the country shared stories of calling their mothers after reading a single passage. Margaret hadn't just left an estate. She left a movement. In a final twist, Melissa discovered one last journal tucked behind a drawer. It was newer, only a few entries. And the last one, dated just a week before Margaret passed, said, "If they come, forgive them. If they don't, I'm still free." Melissa says I'm not invisible. I believe her now. I wanted revenge, but what I got instead was release. They say we die twice, once when we stop breathing and once when our name is spoken for the last time. Thanks to Melissa, my second death won't be for a very long time. Melissa closed the book and placed it beside Margaret's photo. The woman who had once felt forgotten would never be erased again. The email came unexpectedly. "Hello, Melissa. I'm a producer with Oakstream Films. We were moved by Margaret's story and would love to discuss the documentary." Melissa hesitated at first, but after several calls and assurances it wouldn't be a smear piece, just a human one, she agreed. The film crew arrived quietly. Interviews were conducted with neighbors, former colleagues, even old students who still remembered Mrs. Dorsey's soft voice and warm smile. They filmed Melissa reading letters aloud, captured quiet moments in Margaret's garden, and most movingly, Greg standing at Jacob Geller's grave talking softly into the wind. The final cut premiered at a senior advocacy film festival in New York. The title, She Wasn't Invisible, received a standing ovation. Melissa stood on stage, teary-eyed, holding Margaret's framed photo. She wasn't angry, she told the crowd. She was just forgotten. And now she's remembered. 6 months after the premiere, Melissa received a strange call from Lyle. "Something's come up," he said. "You need to come to the office today." Melissa arrived, confused. Lyle handed her a small lockbox. This wasn't a private deposit box. It was opened only after the book royalties exceeded a certain threshold. Inside was a second will. Melissa read slowly. In this revised will, Margaret left 20% of the book royalties to Alan's daughter, Sophie, the one grandchild who had once drawn Margaret a crayon birthday card when no one else remembered. Melissa smiled. The rest remained unchanged. Margaret hadn't written a second will for revenge. She had done it for balance, for grace, for the one spark of kindness that had pierced her solitude. Melissa called Sophie personally. The young woman wept. "I didn't know she remembered that drawing," she said. "She never forgot it," Melissa replied. The legacy was intact. But even more than the money or the fame, it was the story that mattered. A story of how even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. Margaret's final words, printed in bold at the end of the Foundation's annual report, read, "I wasn't erased. I was just waiting for someone to turn the page." If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Call your mom. Hug your dad. Visit your grandma. 'Cause no one deserves to be forgotten. And no voice is ever too small to echo through time. Thank you for watching.